Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for stopping by and checking out the channel. Today, we are going to talk about the comic book series, The Boys. I think that's flipped. Just learning in real time. My video's mirrored. Yes, it's a show. Yes, I've seen the show. I'm not current on the show. I think I'm a season behind. So I had the collected edition of The Boys sitting on my shelf for a while, and around the time season 4 of the show was coming out, I was like, I should reread the series. So I've been plugging away at rereading the series, and I'm just late at recording. So uh, we're just going to talk about the comic. I might throw in some differences between the show and the comics. As with most of my reviews, spoilers ahead, because I have ADHD and I just kind of follow where my brain goes with what I'm talking about. So let's talk about The Boys. The Boys originally started being published in 2006, and I do think that context matters, because some of it hasn't aged well. Some of it is just like sort of that early 2000s edgelord stuff. Like, it's edgy. It's a comic that was originally published at Wildstorm and then moved over to Dark Horse, and so like DC kind of has been around it. Or no, it moved to Dynamite. I don't remember. I'm not that kind of comic book nerd, where I know all the different companies and publishing drama. But it moved around a bit, and DC was loosely kind of had some rights to it and then signed those away. And again, some stuff shifted. And Garth Ennis, who's the author, has spoken about how that actually was a good thing, because they kind of flew under the radar and got to publish it as violent and explicitly as they wanted to, instead of having to meet any sort of publication standards, or like anybody having an editor who was really like nitpicky about stuff. So again, 2006, it's a deconstruction, I would say, of the superhero genre. It's very different than like Watchmen or Kingdom Come. I don't know that Kingdom Come really qualifies as a deconstruction, in that it's still a superhero story. And so it's a weird deconstruction in the sense that like it wants to pull on the strings and kind of look at, well, what would happen if people had superpowers? Well, they'd be awful because people are awful, but the heroes of the story are still superheroes, because the boys themselves are a superhero group. Their costumes are long black trench coats. They're not following the tropes of being superheroes, but it is still a superhero story. I really like the collected edition. I don't get sponsorships or kickbacks here, but the collected edition is a lot of information in each book that has like some of the background stories, and Garth Ennis writing, and Derek Robertson, who's the co-creator and does most of the art throughout the series. They just share a lot of the information and kind of the background. I'm the type of comic book nerd who likes to see the scripts and see how they kind of put comic book run together with the script from the author, and then what the artist has to work with, and how they kind of go. And yeah, so it's all very interesting. But for those of you who are not familiar, welcome. Go read The Boys. The show's pretty good too, at least seasons 1 and 2. 3 is less good, and I haven't seen 4 yet. It's a lot of fun in sort of an irreverent sort of way. So basically, in the universe of The Boys, September 11th happened, but superheroes were involved, and they botched stopping the terrorists. And so instead of crashing into the Twin Towers, the Brooklyn Bridge is destroyed instead. So that's kind of an important thing. Most of the series is set in New York. Obviously, there's some international. They travel around, and there's different soups in different areas. But the general premise is, what if superheroes were corporately owned, and we're trying to get into the military industrial complex, and we're awful people? And one of the key differences, I think, between the movie or the show and the books is how much the military industrial complex is brought up. Like, in the books, Vought American, who's the corporation who kind of owns the rights to the superheroes and markets them and has them has the publication in the comics, has been in American history, like in the military industrial complex, and trying to get in. They have these botched guns that affect World War II. They have these terrible tanks in World War II. World War II is the tanks. Guns were in Vietnam. And so there are all these points where, like, yes, corporate America and capitalism is bad, but I think the books do a lot more to take down the military industrial complex and why it is important to keep soups out of the defense. Why that shouldn't be part of the DoD, and like why keeping that money, corporate money, separate from the government, and like why the government's also bad. So I think there's a lot more of that. There's a whole sub story throughout the boys comic book series about Butcher, who's kind of our main character loosely. The team is the main character, but Billy Butcher's kind of the one of the main characters, and he serves in the Falkland Islands, which again, like Garth Ennis is British, some version of British. Uh, and so he's coming off his run on where he wrote Preacher, which is also really good, but I haven't reread in a long time. And I know there's a lot of John Wayne love, which is probably not aged real well either. But so Garth Ennis is just kind of having fun with like, what if the superheroes were corporately funded and were awful? And so we have these superheroes, the Seven. We have Homelander, who's a spoof of Superman. We have Black Noir. We have Queen Maeve, who's a spoof of Wonder Woman. The Deep, who's a spoof of Aquaman. Uh, Lamplighter and Starlight. And so kind of all these characters are spoofs, and then there's the G-Men and G-Wiz, and there's all these different groups. And so basically Vought American has this chemical that can turn people into superheroes. They've sort of released it into the wild, but they also have these test subjects. And so there are all these people who kind of come by superpowers from being born with them, but it's all chemically induced from Vought American, this company that has these superpowers. And because superheroes are kind of awful twats, the CIA has this group called the Boys, and that's run by Billy Butcher. Greg Mallory in the series, in the comic book series, that's gender swapped. Mallory's a female in the show. And so there's this group run by the CIA who's keeping tabs on them. They also get their hands on Compound V, which is the chemical that turns people into superheroes, so they can kind of go one-on-one with the superheroes. And so the Boys had been around when Greg Mallory was in the CIA. He leaves the group and they're kind of defunct. And where we pick up the story is Billy Butcher, who's kind of the leader of the group, recruits Huey. And Huey's based on Simon Pegg in the comic books. Like, he's very Scottish and very much looks like Simon Pegg. And I think that works really well. It's one of the things that they kind of recast with the show, where Huey isn't Scottish. And I don't know, it makes sense in the story where he has some different takes on like America and like patriotism, and even some different takes on 9/11. And 9/11 is really fundamental to the story in the comics. So having only one of the boys be American, which is Mother's Milk, is the only American in the group. Otherwise, we have the Frenchman, who's French, obviously. We have the woman, or the female, and she's not American. Although I think the show, if I'm remembering correctly, gives her like a much different backstory than the comics has. And then Huey is Scottish and Butcher is British. And so we have kind of all this international cast, and it's still all based around New York. And so that idea of like New York and kind of viewing America through like the lens of capitalism through the lens of New York is all in the story. And so I think having like Huey be Scottish makes sense. And so we pick up with Scotty, that's mixing Huey and Scottish. Huey being recruited. Huey is like at a fair or a festival or something with his girlfriend. He's about to tell her, "I love you," for the first time. And A-Train, one of the superheroes who's a spoof of the Flash, runs through her, like literally runs through her. And Huey's left just holding her hands. And again, like the comic book is gory and very violent, very sexual. And so it lands. The show did a really good job of capturing like how off-putting superheroes really would be. Like Superman's heat lasers that Homelander has would be just horrific. Homelander just destroys people. In the comics, he's often just dripping blood, like covered in blood head to toe. But this is the introduction to the series where we're just kind of left with Huey holding onto these hands and then a big like blood splotch on a brick wall nearby. And so we're introduced to the superheroes are super irresponsible. Vought American works to cover it up by kind of offering Huey a cash settlement and to do nothing. And then Billy Butcher comes in and recruits him to be part of the boys. And Huey is always resistant to fully joining the team. So he's in the team throughout the entire series, but he like tries to quit and he can't handle the violence. He kills a superhero named Blarney Cock because he accidentally punches him through the stomach because he's not used to his superpowers yet. And like again, there's a lot of spoofing superheroes, and like Blarney Cock is kind of an embarrassing character. And so yeah, there's just a lot of making fun of superheroes, and they're not all terrible. Some of them are deeply sympathetic. There's a B team of superheroes who really like look out for each other and take care of each other. And Huey is like protective of them and is like, we shouldn't just kill all superheroes because superheroes are bad. We should protect some of them. Some of them are victims of abuse and have been deeply traumatized. And yes, a lot of them go on to traumatize other people because of their trauma. But again, Huey is kind of the moral voice of reason. He's the sympathetic character. He's the one that's most relatable to, I think, us, the reader. And therefore, he has this morality that, like, Butcher is sort of a fascist in how he approaches, like, eliminating all of the superheroes, whether they're bad guys or not, whether they even realize they have superpowers or not, whether they've been using them to be superheroes, or they're just average person trying to kind of survive. So Huey is the voice throughout the series of like, we should take care of people. If you're given a lot of powers, you should use those for the betterment of humanity, not to be a wanker. And Butcher's kind of the opinion that everybody who has superpowers is a wanker, including himself, which goes into the story. But so we're introduced with that kind of horrific thing. Huey is kind of a bumbling fool throughout the series, and Butcher definitely takes advantage of that. And so Huey, through no knowledge of his own, happens to run into Annie January, who's also Starlight, who is the most recent new recruit of the Seven, which is like the big superhero JLA sort of idea. And so she's disenfranchised. She had to give blowjobs to a bunch of the soups, the A Train and Black Noir and Homelander to get into the Seven. And so she's disenfranchised that, like, thinking these groups of superheroes that she grew up with and this superhero group that she was like a part of in Kansas or some middle America that were all like Christian coded, that she's learning that these people are not actually good people. And she's sort of horrified as like a true believer and somebody who wanted to use her superpowers to be good. And she's a tragic case too. Like none of these characters feel good. Like she grew up, her parents put her in like these little superhero pageants, and like, yeah, it's all horrible and it's all trauma. I had the awesome opportunity to talk to Jason Aaron, who's a comic book writer, on my podcast, Your Therapist Needs Therapy. And we talked about how superheroes all have trauma. And this book, The Boys, is definitely that. Like every character has this traumatic background. Even Huey, to some degree, although he's like, again, kind of the most relatable and therefore the most normal in that, like, he gets picked on and he's weird group of friends and he doesn't really like feel that connected to his parents, even though they love him very much. Like he has more of a regular person arc, and that's why being in the boys is so jarring for him. He just can't like quite wrap his head around these awful people and how much money is at play and how like much destruction can happen so quickly. So like we're introduced to Butcher when he basically finds a warehouse of superheroes who are going to overthrow the government in Russia. Um, and we get the to meet the love sausage, and there's just a lot of off color superheroes involved. Um, but we kind of follow Huey getting to the point of like trying to rescue and save people. Huey is not at all playing a role of Spider-Man, but I think it's one of those things that when you get into comics like Spider-Man, one of the things that sets Spider-Man apart from other superheroes is A, he's poor. He lives in his own apartment and he's always trying to pay his rent, and that's a big stressor for him. And he's always trying to save people. Like he feels bad for the bad guys. He wants to save them and help them. He wants them not just locked up indefinitely. He wants to help them. And so Huey is kind of that character. He's not like Spider-Man in any other way other than he genuinely wants to help people, and he's trying to help people because I think he can relate to needing help. And so he's kind of processed some of his own trauma in the way that like it's okay to need help and having your community. He has these weird, off-putting friends in Scotland that we get to meet later in the series, but are like lovable, kind of silly characters. Not like silly, like laugh at them, but like just regular humans living their regular human lives, and they get caught up in selling drugs, and there's some other stuff. Um, so the series just kind of like shows us this progression, these progressions of like these people being put in awful situations, and how different people from different backgrounds and with different levels of resources handle these things differently, whether these resources are financial or these resources are superpowers or good community support, whatever it is. So, we have we have Mother's Milk, who has a really terrible relationship with an ex, but he has a daughter by that ex. And so he's trying to be a good parent, but he's in and out of her life, and she has resentment for him. And so we have these very human moments throughout the series. Queen Maeve, who's one of the superheroes, really just turns to substance abuse after failing to stop one of the planes on 9/11. And so the series has like Homelander and Queen Maeve and Black Noir, all of the seven try and save this plane, but they can't. And so Homelander just like destroys the plane to destroy the evidence, and is horrific. And Queen Maeve just goes to having sex with lots of dudes, and having like one of her greatest fans be a total slave to her, and like drinking constantly. And again, like Starlight's really put off by this, thinking Maeve, they'll be like the girls on the team and buddies, and Maeve really detests her. Um, and so we have all of this, but Maeve also is feeding the boys information, and so she has some like morality left inside of her. And so it's interesting to read the series. They're all kind of awful people. Even Huey and Starlight have their moments of like not being great, especially in their relationship to each other. And it's still the superhero story where like the good guys sort of prevail. So this is like the big bad spoilers here. I haven't really spoiled too much here, but the series progresses, and Butcher again tries to kill every soup everywhere, anyone who has Compound V, whether they're a superhero or not. And so Huey's kind of like, "You're going to kill us," and Huey has this awful realization that Butcher has killed MM and the female and the Frenchman, and plans to kill Huey and himself as well. And so Butcher is this deeply disturbed character. He's kind of an awful dude. He's raised by an alcoholic and abusive dad. He goes into the military because he's violent and likes the violence. And then he meets Becky, and Becky like gets him sorted, sort of, and he wants to be a better person for her. And then we learn that she's raped by a superhero. She has a baby who she dies in childbirth because the baby comes out and is flying and has laser eyes, and Butcher has to kind of horrifically, very graphically in the comics, kill this flying superhero baby. And so Butcher's like, "This is Homelander. It was Homelander. It was Homelander." He finds her diary, where she talks about Homelander. And then the big reveal in the comics is that Black Noir is a clone of Homelander who has lost his mind, but was created with the idea that he could kill Homelander if needed. And so a lot of these horrible things that Homelander thinks he's done, and Homelander kind of goes crazy. And Homelander isn't a good character. He is an awful superhero and person. But Black Noir has done a lot of these awful things. And so yeah, it's just a mess. And so Huey and Butcher are left kind of at the end. Huey has thwarted Butcher's plan to not kill the soups, but also like they're both dying because they fall out of, I forget which building in New York, the Empire State Building or something, one of those big famous New York buildings. And yeah, and then we're left with Vought American isn't able to have their superheroes in the Department of Defense, and they have these huge scandals as Homelander and Queen Maeve and all these people are shown to be awful people, and the public finds out, and Vought American has to pivot. But one of the things that comes up in the story is that like Butcher was going to end Vought American, and so Huey kind of gets in the way of that. And so Vought American, after having terrible tanks that cost a bunch of Americans in World War II, and terrible guns that cost a bunch of American lives in Vietnam, and terrible superheroes who kill a bunch of people in the present timeline in the series, Vought American continues on. And so it's kind of this commentary on how superheroes would be terrible people, but also that corporations are terrible entities, and so is the military industrial complex. And so I think the series gets really political in season 4. It's been political the whole time. Like again, if you can't see the fascist undertones in this story, both from what Butcher's trying to do and from what Vought American is doing, it's not subtle. This is not a series that is subtle in any way, shape, or form. Um, but it does have some, I think, interesting things to say about kind of superheroes. Again, like this wasn't this was transgressive, deeply transgressive at the time. Even when the show came out, like I remember watching the first season of the show and being like, wow, like it garnered a lot of attention because of how violent it was, just like over the top. And like that is what is in the series. And so when we're thinking about like a deconstruction, something that's kind of taking what we understand as the tropes of these superhero stories and pulling on those threads to see what happens, like superheroes being bad and like deeply violent just hits very different. Like there's other series that have covered some of the stuff, like Kick-Ass comes to mind, and yeah, there's I don't know, there's other stuff that goes this way, but like this is very violent. Garth Ennis is coming off of Preacher, which was pretty violent, and Derek Robinson had been writing for Transmetropolitan before this. So like I like the art style. Transmetropolitan is another series I should do a review of that I've reread recently. This is a whole separate topic of what to do with art created by not good people. But yeah, the artwork and the story in this is really great. It's deeply political was the point I was making, that like the commentary, I think that the show was deeply political, but like kind of just on the nose of like fascist and the MAGA movement in general, but less so about like I think the military industrial complex. They do hit late stage capitalism pretty hard, but I think it's definitely like the military industrial complex is skewered in the comic book series a little bit more. And then also like deeply making fun of the comic book industry. There's this character, the Legend, who's a comic book writer, and he's pretty pivotal in both disillusioning wee Huey to how terrible soups are, but is also like caught up in sort of the drama of who has permission to write which characters. And he's in love with Queen Maeve, and they have a child together. And yeah, it's it's a lot of fun. In my review of Deadpool and Wolverine, like I talk about how much fun it is. Like The Boys is in a much similar to Deadpool, I guess. Like that irreverent comedy. It's very dark. It's very sexual. It just isn't pulling any punches on like this is what humanity is, and so if we gave humanity superpowers, we just crank it up to 11. Here's what would happen. Um, and I think Huey represents like the good parts of humanity, and I think the difference is like trauma again. People who are addressing their trauma and healing from it versus and therefore they want to help other people, they want to build community, versus people who are still deeply injured and are trying to injure other people. They're lashing out. Hurt people is that sort of cliche. So I think it's written from a fairly simplistic view of like psychology, but it's fun if you can stomach the violence and some of the explicit nature. Like it's really fun. Like I had a lot of enjoyment in reading it. It's so unrealistic. It serves that purpose, I think, for a lot of media, that it's so unrealistic that you can sort of escape reality in it, even if it is commenting on late stage capitalism and the military industrial complex, and it's deconstructing the superheroes. Yes, but like it's about some real things. But like I'm also reading Animal Farm. No, not Animal Farm, Animal Pound by Tom King, which is a retelling of Animal Farm, but for our modern times. Like that's been really hard for me to enjoy. It's very well written. It's very well drawn. But so like nose on the what's the phrase? It's so on the head, but like it's too close to real life, even though it's written about animals that take over their pound. And it's retelling of Animal Farm, but like it's not fun. It's sort of depressing to read, and it's again very well done, but it's not fun. And The Boys is a lot of fun. The Boys is graphic, but like so over the top that you can really kind of like let your brain turn off and be different than the real world that we're living in. You can pull on some of those threads and be like, I agree, the military industrial complex is a problem. And these are policy choices that we have people who are homeless and in need, where we spend our money on Department of Defense and late stage capitalism, corporations. The idea that we wouldn't be okay with child labor in our neighborhoods in our communities, but the separation, the we know that there's child labor that Nike uses and other big corporations use in other countries, and like we can sort of distance ourselves through the deniability that giant corporations present, and like, yeah, that's not great. So again, it's about real things and it's commenting on real things. It's the Falkland war in British history and 9/11 in American history. Like these are real events and impacted people. And so taking fictional characters and seeing how they're affected by these things, I think again is a good depiction of like trauma. And some people handle it better than others. Not that they handle the trauma better, but they pursue their healing in different ways. And some of times people who are traumatized are then self-destructive after the fact, and some people are able to heal in a healthy way and grow and come back from those traumatic events. So I think it's interesting there. I think most comic book series again deal with some trauma. So I'm not necessarily saying it does great at that. I'm just saying it's in there. I'm a therapist talking about the psychology in these series, but like it's just fun. Like it's not a super deep thinker. I think the commentary that's in there is accurate and it's just so over the top. But it's a lot of fun. You come to kind of like and connect with a lot of these characters in different ways, even if they're awful people. They're different representations of awfulness and different lived experiences in humanity. And so there's some messed up family dynamics, and there's some relationship issues, and then on top of it, there's just the over the top superhero stuff. There's hero gasm, and there's blowing up the heads of a warehouse full of superheroes, and yeah, there's a lot of violence in it, but it's good. It's one of those things where I think if you've enjoyed the show, but you haven't read the comics, like, it's definitely worth it to go back and read the comics. If you haven't watched either, I would recommend them both. I think they're both good. Again, I'm a season behind on the series, so I don't stand by that opinion if season 4 really is trash. But the comic book series is a lot of fun. I have the collected editions, again, the big fat, that's not a small book. And it came out after the show came out, since all the show characters are on the cover. But like, I like the collected editions. I think there's a lot of fun information at the backs of those. There's 6 of those omnibus editions, so I got them on sale, which is why I have all of the new ones, uh, the new edition ones in the big omnibus, because great comic book shop had them on sale, so I couldn't pass it up. So I recommend it. I think they're fun. Again, if you're not somebody who likes blood, or you don't like violence, you're squeamish, not for you. You're not the desired audience. But if you, for some reason, are a fan of superheroes or a fan of comic books and haven't come across The Boys, I strongly recommend it. Lots of fun in that irreverent, sort of skewering, satirical way. So that's The Boys. I'm Jeremy. Like I said, licensed marriage and family therapist. If you want to hear my takes on the psychology of other superhero shows, stories, let me know. Drop down in the comments. Like, subscribe. All that stuff helps other people find me. Hopefully putting out helpful, useful information about comics, or about mental health as portrayed in comics and shows and movies. So yeah, all that algorithm stuff isn't so that I can get internet famous. It's so that people can find, hopefully, some useful information about mental health. All right, y'all. Take care of yourself. Take care of somebody else. Peace.